We learned in Module 19 about self-correction from inflationary or recessionary gaps. When equilibrium is not on the long run, that means our unemployment rate is not our current rate of full employment. It's either higher or lower. And when unemployment is off, that changes nominal wages, which in turn change SRAS. That shift brings us back to our long run curve. So we know it will self-correct, but that self-correction could take a decade. Some economists would like to intervene in the economy, and they want it to change faster. John Maynard Keynes is considered the founder of macroeconomics, and his major quote is, "In the long run, we are all dead." From that quote alone, you can tell that he is someone who believes that we shouldn't wait for the economy to fix itself because we might be dead by then. We should act now. So he believes that governments should correct economies instead of waiting for them to self-correct over time. And if you remember, which line can governments directly affect? Do governments have more control over AD or over SRAS? Governments have more control over AD because that is the line that's going to be shifted by fiscal policy. So he believes not only that we should intervene, but that we should use government policy to shift AD and to get us back to our long-run potential. Stabilization policies are the concept that we're going to use government policy, this could be either fiscal or monetary, to intervene in an economy in order to shorten recessions or rein in expansionary periods. Now remember, neither of these parts of the business cycle are good. Recessions bring with them high unemployment. Expansionary periods bring with them inflation. So we want to balance the highs and the lows and make sure that neither one of them get too extreme. And that's what stabilization policy does. These policies can take years, especially with fiscal policy. As you know, Congress and the president normally are involved with these changes. So it's not going to be an immediate change, but even if it takes 4 years, that could be shorter than 8 to 10 years of waiting for self-correction. We're going to get into how stabilization policies work to solve different gaps in our economy. Negative demand shocks cause recessionary gaps. You can look at this model and see that we have a negative demand shock because AD has shifted left. This takes us away from our long run potential. Assuming that E1 was on the long run, E2 is now to the left of long run. We're making less than our potential output, so we're in a recessionary gap. You can see from E1 to E2, the price level fell and real GDP fell. When output is down, that means that unemployment is going to be increasing. That's why we want to often intervene to try to reduce this problem and make sure that people, if they are unemployed, that it will be for a shorter time period and not for many, many years. So both types of government policy, fiscal and monetary, can reverse this decline. Now, technically, fiscal policy is the one that's directly controlled by the government. The government, in terms of president and Congress, can control taxes, transfers, and government spending. In American governments, the monetary policy is separate. The Federal Reserve is supposed to be separate from our government, and they control monetary policy. But in some economies, fiscal and monetary are both controlled by the government. So loosely speaking, fiscal and monetary are both government policies, even though in America, fiscal is the only one that's directly controlled. We do appoint the chairperson of the Federal Reserve, and there will be other areas of involvement in monetary policy that we'll learn a little bit later on. But as long as you're aware of how it's done in America, that's okay for now. So looking at this problem, at E2, we can see that we need to fix this problem. Now the question is how? Fiscal policy shifts AD. Which way would we want it to shift to fix this gap? If AD shifts right, that can bring us back onto our long-run potential. So in terms of fiscal policy, if you increase government spending, that can shift AD right. If you increase government transfers, that could also increase AD and solve our problem. Or if you decided to cut personal taxes, sales tax, income tax, that would have the same effect of reducing this gap. For monetary policy, that is about money supply. If the Federal Reserve printed more money, if they increased the money supply, that would allow interest rates to fall, that would increase spending, and that would solve our gap as well. So you could do a combination of fiscal and monetary solutions, or just pick one. The governments could intervene in a negative demand shock, or they could wait for the economy to self-correct. So the question is, should we intervene? There's a pro and a con, of course, for government intervention and not just letting the economy fix itself. The pro is price stability. There are three goals of every economy: economic growth, full employment, and price stability. When aggregate demand is falling, and the negative demand shock, that leads to a decrease in APL. When APL decreases, that creates deflation. Deflation is bad for our economy because it creates really high unemployment. When prices are falling, businesses feel like their profits are being cut and they're going to start laying off workers. So in order to stop this period of deflation in a recession, if we intervened, it would bring us price stability as opposed to letting things get worse before they start to self-correct. The con is that the fiscal policies that we would do in order to fix this problem, while it will fix the recessionary gap, they actually lead to budget deficits. A budget deficit is the idea that our federal budget for the nation would end up in debt as a result of this action. And let's talk about why. So here are the three types of fiscal policy that we can do to combat a recession. If we're combating a recession that was caused by a negative demand shock, our solution is to increase demand, and that'll fix this gap. So if we're increasing demand, we could increase government spending, we could increase transfers, we could cut taxes. Any of these things by themselves or in combination will fix the recession. But if you increase government spending, that puts us more in debt. If you increase transfers, that puts us more in debt. If you take away tax revenue, that puts us more in debt. So all three of these solutions might be good for the short-term gap, but they lead to long-term budget deficits. So if we tried to intervene every single time things took a downturn, it could lead to a really, really big budget deficit. We've been talking more generically about when there is a recession, what could we do? But let's talk about what's actually happened in recent history. So the Great Recession was the most recent recession, started around 2008, ended around 2014. And this was the longest and worst recession that our nation has seen. In order to combat such a bad recession, the government used all the tools at its discretion. So we used both fiscal and monetary policy. So if we wanted to use fiscal, which is what we did, we increased government spending. We also cut taxes, and both of those things are trying to encourage people to have more disposable income, go out and spend. We also used expansionary monetary policy. That means we increased the money supply. So the Federal Reserve got involved. They decided, let's lower interest rates in order to encourage consumer and investment spending. And the way to lower interest rates is to increase money supply. You've also seen that when interest rates are low, that by itself will increase aggregate demand. It will shift it to the right and help solve this problem. So we did everything we could, monetary and fiscal policy, to get out of this recession. Even though it was the worst recession we've seen, America actually was able to get out of the recession sooner than a lot of countries in the European Union, in Asia. There were other countries around the world, major Western powers, They're also suffering from a recession. So we can compare our recovery to another nation. And even though not every variable is the same, a lot of economists are giving the American government credit for trying to use all of the tools in its economic discretion in order to get out of this recession. Now let's look at positive demand shocks, which create inflationary gaps. In this picture, if we started with a long run at E1, you can tell that there's a positive demand shock because AD shifted right. This creates an inflationary gap. We can see the price level went up, but output went up too. When E2 is to the right of long run, that tells you that we're making more than our potential, so unemployment is going to be down. That's a good thing. The problem is that the price level went up, so we have inflation. That's why it's called an inflationary gap. The solution, if we're going to use a fiscal policy, would be to try to decrease AD. If we shift it back to the left, that will solve our gap. So we had an increase. How do we solve it? So our goal is to decrease AD. Fiscal policy wise, we could decrease AD by cutting government spending, cutting government transfers, or by increasing tax rates. Any of those things would be fiscal policy solutions. For monetary policy, we would need to decrease the money supply, which would raise interest rates, and that would cut aggregate demand. It would shift it back to the left. In the two previous examples, we saw how fiscal policy can help create problems that were caused by demand shocks. Demand shocks are much easier to fix because whatever happens to demand, either we have price and output rising, only one of those is bad, the price increase, or price and output falling. In that case, the major issue is output falling. So we have one thing that's not so bad and one thing that is bad when you're looking at demand shocks. The issue with supply shocks is that whatever we do to try to intervene with a supply shock is going to make something worse. If you're trying to reduce unemployment, you're going to make inflation worse and vice versa. So, demand shocks, intervention works. Supply shocks, we can't really intervene without making something else worse. So it's going to have to be really bad to justify that intervention. Otherwise, we're going to wait for the economy to self-correct if the problem was started by a supply shock issue. The previous slide was saying that the major issue with trying to intervene in a supply shock created gap is that you make something worse. So I wanted to go ahead and show you why that's true. In this case, we have a negative supply shock because SRAS shifted to the left. This creates a recessionary gap because output is less than our potential. Now, we can see that when short-run supply shifted left, prices went up, so we have inflation. But because our output is less than our potential, we also have unemployment. So we have the worst of both situations. With demand shocks, you have one or the other, inflation or unemployment. Here we have both. Remember, this is stagflation. Price level went up and growth went down. Our output went down. And we're going to have high unemployment. So we know we have two really bad problems, so what do we do about it? If we decided to shift AD to the right, okay, not the straightest of lines, but you get the general point here. Actually, let me try that again. So if we decided to shift it to the right, that's better. So here is our new E3. So is our inflation better or worse? Our inflation is actually worse because you can see that the price level has continued to rise. Now, our unemployment is better because we went from high unemployment when we were making less than our potential back to long run, and long run is our level of full employment. So increasing AD, while it fixes unemployment, it makes inflation worse. So we can't increase AD. All right, what if we decrease AD? What if we shift it to the left? Well, then our equilibrium would be the new AD here. So in that case, our price level went down from E2. So we fixed our inflation, but our unemployment is worse because we're even further to the left of our potential than we were before. So move AD one way, worsen inflation. Move it the other way, you worsen unemployment. You can now see, I hope, why this is the type of situation where any intervention is going to make something worse, so it's best just to stop and let the economy self-correct. Knowing that fiscal policy is the main governmental policy that we use to intervene with demand shocks, let's go ahead and review a little bit about what fiscal policy is and then add some more to our knowledge of fiscal policy. First of all, fiscal policy includes three categories of things: taxes, government spending, and government transfers. Now, here's a new thing that we haven't talked about before. Which taxes are not demand? Most taxes are. Sales tax, paid by consumers. Income taxes, paid by consumers. Even, so there's something called an excise tax, and these are taxes that are paid on certain types of goods that we're trying to discourage, like sugary sodas in New York City have an extra tax, and tanning booths in lots of places have extra taxes. And those are all paid for by the consumers. Anytime consumers are paying the tax, that affects aggregate demand. So the overwhelming majority of the time, taxes are a demand shifter. But there's one exception, and those are business taxes. If the tax is paid by the producer or the firm, not the consumer, that would shift SRAS. So if the federal government decided to put taxes on a certain type of industry, maybe we're trying to discourage tobacco or something like that, we could put a tax on the businesses themselves, and that would cut profit and that would decrease supply. We could also potentially do tax breaks or tax cuts and do some sort of tax incentive for businesses, and that would affect supply too. So if it's a business tax, SRAS is shifted. And that is the only time where the fiscal policy would ever be involved with SRAS. Every other category of the time, fiscal policy shifts aggregate demand. But I want you to be aware of the one exception to that rule. Let's also review that the three major categories of fiscal policy are not all equal. Government spending is different than taxes and transfers in the sense that it is the only one that directly increases AD. Remember, all of the government spending gets spent in round one, whereas taxes and transfers affect consumers' disposable income. And from that, they're going to spend some and save some. So these are not created equal. Government spending is more effective in shifting AD than taxes or transfers. Now, adding another level onto this, a balanced budget does not have a neutral impact on the economy. So that is this last sentence here. And it's something that we hadn't talked about yet. We have done government spending, taxes, and transfers all in isolation. What if they do one or the other? But oftentimes they do combinations of these things. So a $5 million government spending increase might get passed through Congress because there's going to be a $5 million tax increase that'll pay for it. So this might seem like a balanced budget, right? We have a spending increase, but a tax increase to take care of that. So that should theoretically cancel each other out, but it doesn't. So this is telling you that this is going to still impact AD. And the question is, well, which direction will AD shift? If government spending increases, that will shift AD to the right. That will increase it. A tax increase would shift AD to the left. That would decrease it. But they're not equal. Because government spending multiplies further than a tax increase because all of it gets spent from the beginning and then that larger amount can multiply, for that reason, aggregate demand will shift right. It will increase. So it looks like you balanced your budget, but the multiplier effects of those two things are not the same. Two new words for us to learn: expansionary and contractionary policies. These terms are applied to lots of things, not just fiscal. An expansionary policy expands, it's an increase. So we have all kinds of words here. You could say it's a right shift, it's an outward shift, it's an increase, it's expansionary. I know that's a lot. But the idea is if aggregate demand increased through fiscal policy, you could say that was an expansionary fiscal policy. But if fiscal policy made AD decrease, you could say that was a contractionary fiscal policy. Contractionary policies decrease left or inward shift, it contracts the line. Now, this can also be done through monetary policy. Expansionary monetary policy increases the money supply. AD would shift right. Contractionary monetary policy decreases the money supply. AD would shift left. So expansionary just means right shift. It increased, it expanded. Contractionary is left shift, it decreased. Now, I do want you to know what these words mean and the fact that they can be applied to other terms. But expansionary alone and contractionary, hopefully we can keep those straight. Let's practice with these expansionary and contractionary fiscal policy concepts. You can look at the picture below. I know it's not fully labeled, but we can see that this is a recessionary gap because equilibrium is to the left of our potential. Therefore, we're in a recessionary period. If we're going to use fiscal policy, we need to shift it to the right, and that gets us back to our long runs. This is our goal. We want to increase AD. And that's why you would say they were using expansionary fiscal policy. Expansionary because it's an increase, and fiscal because we're going to use those government tools to shift AD. Now, within those three tools, we have government spending, taxes, and transfers. If our goal is to increase AD, we would increase government spending. We could cut taxes. Remember, anything but business taxes, and we could increase government transfers. So any of those three things would be within expansionary fiscal policy, and those would work during a recessionary gap. Next, we're looking at an inflationary gap, where equilibrium is to the right or greater than our potential. In this case, prices are too high. And in order to rein in that inflation, we're going to use contractionary fiscal policy. Let's decrease aggregate demand, shift it to the left, and that will bring us back to our long run potential. So for the options of contractionary fiscal policy, we could decrease government spending, increase consumer paid taxes, sales tax, income tax, etc., or decrease government transfers. Any of those things are contractionary because they shift AD to the left. So see, these words, contractionary and expansionary, aren't that bad. It's just adding on a term to something that you already know and understand. At the end of the module, you might be thinking, well, why don't we just always use fiscal policy to fix our problems? We know how it works. We know the money's going to multiply. Why don't we just fix all of our gaps? Well, the issue is that fiscal policy is, by its very definition, political. So we actually need to make sure that the Congress and the president are working together and in agreement for these things. And because it has to go through all of those political processes, there can be time lags. Lags are delays. If you're lagging behind, you're being slow. So the first way that fiscal policy can lag is the recognition lag. It can take a while for economic data to be analyzed, and often there's kind of this political discussion and debate in the early stages of a recession where the people that are in power are saying, no, no, it's not a recession, things are fine. And the party that's not in power is saying, oh, look how awful the economy is. You've probably already noticed that with things happening in the news, especially during elections. So step one is recognizing you have a problem, right? In this case, recognizing we have an economic problem and there can be delays to that occurring. Step two is, okay, fine, we agree that there's a problem, but now what? First of all, should we act? Or is the recession or inflationary period not that big and we can just let it self-correct? Once you decide to act, well then which tool are you going to use? Government spending, taxes, or transfers? The different political parties tend to have their preferences on this matter. Republicans are more focused on cutting taxes. Democrats are more focused on government spending in terms of social programs. So both parties usually have the solution in mind that they would prefer. And then you have to debate it out in Congress and get people to agree with your solution if you're going to act. And then finally, there's one more lag. Let's say that Congress and the president and all of these groups have agreed we're in a recession, we need to act, this is the solution. Well, then there's even further delays as you start implementing the policy. So it could be something where it doesn't go into effect until January of the next year. It could be something where you decide on government spending and you're going to build all of these roads and bridges and infrastructural things. But then at the beginning, you have to do all of the plans for that, and that takes time too. The point of all of this is that we know that the economy is self-correcting. That's what naturally occurs. So if these lags are really long, by the time fiscal policy actually starts, the economy might have begun to fix itself. So the solution can actually create the opposite problem. And this is what I mean. I will try to draw this as simply as possible. So we're in a recession. We know that supply is going to automatically, short-run supply is the one that self-corrects. But if things are already starting to fix themselves, by the time you actually increase AD, you might go too far. And now we're over here. So instead of going back to the long-run potential that we were hoping for, we've overcompensated. Our delays mean that we're actually reacting more than we should because the problem has already started fixing itself. And now we went from a recessionary gap to an inflationary gap, from one problem to another. And you can imagine that the opposite is also true. That if Congress is deciding to act to solve an inflationary gap and to rein in spending and to cut costs, if they go too far or if they wait too long by the time they finally act, they might stop things so much that they create a recession. They create the opposite problem. So it's important to be aware that fiscal policy isn't perfect. It certainly can work, and it did work to shorten the Great Recession, but there are lags, there are issues with this policy as well.